Hi, today I want to talk a little bit about an underrated branch of philosophy, namely the philosophy of history. Whereas the historian tries to establish what happened in the past, the philosopher of history endeavors to answer questions like why it happened, whether there are discernible patterns or processes in history, how events interact with the human psyche, and what this can teach us about human society, art, science, and so on. Some of the most famous gentlemen who have contributed to the philosophy of history include Hesiod, Plato, Augustine, Ibn Khaldun, Machiavelli, Voltaire, Rousseau, Herder, Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, Toynbee, Popper, Foucault, and Fukuyama. Now, the reason why I said this branch of philosophy is underrated is that it fell into disrepute in the second half of the 20th century, mainly because of World War II. Philosophers like Augustine, Hegel, and Marx had posited that history is progressing toward an ultimate goal, which is a teleological conception of history. The thought that history will one day end in some form of higher state or completion from which little will subsequently change. But after the disasters of World War II and of the 20th century in general, thinkers began to disregard the historical predictions of philosophers, and indeed speculative philosophy of history as a whole, because they feared that it would lead to dictators like Hitler and Stalin who thought that they had understood history and thus could be the saviors of mankind. Popper, for example, maintained that speculation about greater historical forces would lead to utopian social planning, such as by Nazis and communists. But my view is that this objection of Popper's is only to be leveled at false speculation and at speculation for the sake of totalitarian purposes, not against speculation in and of itself. Nietzsche, for instance, who as opposed to his older contemporary Marx was not a totalitarian, was far more correct than Marx, albeit a low threshold, about what would happen in the 20th century. And so speculative philosophy of history and historical prediction may still be useful. Now, someone else, in addition to Popper, who led the charge against this linear or teleological conception of history after the war, was Foucault. But although I think he was right to reject historical linearity, the idea that history progresses toward a goal, I believe that he went too far in the other extreme and that he rejected any larger patterns of history that could be gleaned out of past events. And by this rejection, he got himself involved in a lot of internal contradictions in his thinking, but that's a whole other analysis. And so the philosophy of history ought to be rehabilitated from both these extremes. When we rehabilitate the philosophy of history, we reject the Augustinian, Hegelian, Marxist view of history as progress toward a goal, but also the opposing view that history has no patterns or larger narratives at all to offer and that the future is a blank slate. This middle position includes the notion that history, in some respects, moves cyclically, something that I also discussed a bit in my video Charlottesville and American Tribalism and Reason, which I'll link to in the description below. I say in some respects because it cannot be denied that since history involves everything, it is easy to find areas where development has in fact been more linear, even if not perfectly so, like technology and medicine. So this moderate philosophy of history understands that history repeats itself, that civilizations move through natural cycles of rise and fall, and that this process is to a great extent driven by human nature and mass psychology, which are constants in human history. From this perspective, perhaps the most important philosopher of history, whom I haven't yet mentioned, was Thucydides, in whose History of the Peloponnesian War we find the pre-Augustinian and hence pre-Christian and, in my view, correct view, according to which the confusion and incorrigibility of human nature excludes any teleology. Since human nature is a constant across ages and civilizations, it stands to reason that human beings, not every individual, to be sure, but certainly the large mass, will react similarly to similar stimuli. Indeed, Augustine's Christian work, The City of God, according to which history is divided into epochs that work themselves toward a goal of ultimate pristine blessing, makes it easier to see that all later teleological and progressivist descriptions of history lie in the shadow of the cross. This temptation of positing an end or goal of history and human affairs is always strong, because it is an intellectual expression of laziness or exhaustion with life. It is similar to lying down in bed after a long working day and saying, "It is finished, we are done." It is an inability to live with the negative and to support the uncertain, the inability to bear the thought that there will never be salvation and that people's cares and tragedies will always occur and recur. But if one does have the ability to bear that thought and to live with negativity, to look at the world and see eternal suffering without outcome, then, in my opinion, one will have a clearer, more accepting, and also a more creative view of things, tantamount to what John Keats called negative capability, the ability to accept the negative and to turn it into art and beauty. Positing an end to history can also be an expression of narcissism, because those philosophers who do so often seem to believe that they are the privileged ones who are to experience that end of history. Both Marx and Hegel were guilty of this to at least some extent, Fukuyama as well. Just like dictators, revolutionaries, and sundry riffraff want to be able to say that they experienced the radical moment in history when everything changed, which makes them mindlessly want to take up arms against just about anything at all, as long as it is a proper revolution, so too philosophical totalitarians want to be the embodiment of the end of history and preside over its magnificent conclusion. This posture is, of course, to be rejected, as it has no grounding in historical evidence. But although history moves cyclically in many respects, one can also see that there is a certain forward movement overall. That is to say, history moves in something resembling a helical pattern. Like a spiral, history moves in circles, but with each circle pushing slightly ahead of the previous one. To take as an example the issue of democratization, the democratization of Western society is helical. Political power becomes more broadly diffused as a society progresses, but with each new society, the end point is generally somewhat farther ahead than that of the previous society. And so we recognize a similar democratizing phenomenon recurring in different civilizations through history, but with the phenomenon going a little further with each new manifestation. Ancient Athens, for example, developed democracy during its social progress, as has the US, but our democracy has pushed further ahead than the Greeks did, and so that's an example of helical movement. Ultimately, however, while there is some of this forward movement in history, it will ultimately not lead to any higher pristine state of being, but will only come to an end one day with the annihilation of our species. And on that very cheerful note, thank you for watching.